Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and today we're going to look at some of the tools, techniques, and things you should consider when you're preparing for and flying a bush trip in Microsoft Flight Sim. We'll look at a few things on the ground first that can make for a more enjoyable experience, and then we'll get in the air and look at some of the challenges that you're going to run into, like canyon turns, short fields, unorthodox approaches, and so on. Let's start with the first decision that you have to make with any bush trip, and that's picking a location, which can obviously be anywhere in the world, but my top spots are Alaska, Idaho, and the Alps. Each of them has lots of mountains and valleys to explore, but also a lot of airstrips that are fairly close together, so you can do a lot of legs in a short period of time. I'll typically plan for 3 or 4 legs of around 15 to 20 minutes each, so it makes for a session that isn't too long, but it keeps you engaged the whole time because you're constantly working the plane from one phase to the next. Now by default, a lot of the smaller airfields in Flight Sim can be just that, literally a stretch of grass or dirt, but what's nice is that there are a lot of freeware airstrips available on flightsim.to, if you're on PC of course, which adds a bit more realism to the experience. That'll often influence the route that I plan on flying, and once I've picked 1 or 2 of those freeware airports, I'll head into the default planner to pad that out and add another couple stops along the way. I'm usually looking for an airfield that's going to provide me with a challenge in one way or another, so that could be a short field, a tricky approach in the mountains, or even just a scenic view as I'm coming in, typically with a runway that's going to be near water of some kind. I also try to pick a route that I can fly entirely visually to make things more engaging, rather than just following the magenta line around, which will mean figuring out some landmarks to use as waypoint markers, be it mountains, valleys, towns, or roads. If you get lost, you can always fall back to the built-in tablet or the GPS integrated into the airplane to figure out where you are, but it's a lot of fun and way more challenging to do this without relying on those tools. We're going to look at some specific bush flying techniques in a second here, but before that I want to quickly touch on the best bush plane options in Flight Sim. If you have the Premium Deluxe Edition or you want to buy it as a standalone from the marketplace, the best bush plane in my opinion is the Savage Northern. The only downside to it though is that it is a bit slow with a cruise speed of about 100 knots. It has the chunky tires that are a staple when it comes to bush planes, but regular tires work fine as well, honestly, so you don't have to limit yourself in your plane selection. And another one of my favorites is the DHC2 Beaver, which has a nice level of detail for a default plane. If you're more comfortable with a tricycle gear rather than a tail dragger because they are harder to handle, the X-Cub and even the C-152 and the 172 can be used as bush planes too. Where all of these options start to struggle though is at high altitude, and if you're taking off and landing from above 7,000 feet, like say if you're flying around Colorado, it might be time to swap the piston engine for a turboprop. The best option at that point becomes the Draco, which is in the standard edition, so everybody's got it, and it has all of the power you'll ever need and then some for high altitude ops, but it can be pretty tough on landing until you get the hang of it. Let's get into some practical tips now, and we'll work our way through this logically. So we're going to start with pre-flight and we'll look at what you should do when you first load in. Backcountry strips usually have a single runway, and it can be tricky to figure out which direction to take off from because you're very unlikely to have an accurate wind report in the tablet for here, and it might be from a fair distance away. For the most part, we want to take off into the wind to reduce our takeoff distance and our ground speed so that we can get in the air faster, and the most reliable way to check that is with the windsock. With that, you can figure out which end of the runway makes the most sense for takeoff, but if there is no windsock, you still need to find a way to figure it out, or you could be in trouble on takeoff. The next best thing is to have a look at the direction that the pitot covers are blowing when you're still in walk around mode. I find it works relatively well even in moderate to light winds. Next, because I'm unlikely to be familiar with the area, I'll switch into drone mode to do a bit of a reconnaissance tour and familiarize myself with the surroundings. There's a few things I'm looking for. First off, just a quick check of the runway to make sure there aren't any surprises like weird elevation issues, any rocks on the runway, or weird scenery issues that just shouldn't be there. Sometimes you need to do a maneuver after takeoff to turn away from terrain, and this is where you would evaluate that as well, especially if something unplanned happens. You want to know what you're going to do ahead of time. If there's anything past the end of the runway, you're going to want to plan to initially climb out at the speed that's going to give you the best angle of climb for the plane, which is often called the VX speed. Oftentimes you'll be able to find what this speed is on a panel somewhere in the cockpit, but if it's not written anywhere easy to find, you can always look it up online for the plane that you're flying. If you're taking off at a soft field, so grass or dirt like this one, you want to try and get off the ground as soon as you can to avoid bouncing up and down on the uneven surface. The way to do that, of course, is to pull back on the controls to get in the air as soon as possible, but the ground-to-air mechanics in Flight Sim are a bit wonky, and it can cause you to pitch up drastically the moment it transitions from one to the other, so I actually tend to only slightly pull back on the controls as I get rolling. Then once you start to lift off, you can release that pressure and stay close to the runway in ground effect to build up speed faster, and then once you've reached your VX speed, you can start your climb out as normal. Flying in mountainous areas is probably the most fun and challenging part of bush flying, but luckily we have some tools to help us find our way. The first of those is the terrain display on the G3X or the G1000, since you can see where the valleys and peaks are around you, so it helps you to avoid making a wrong turn along the way. Even a simple GPS like the GNS530 or 430 has a relative terrain radar that you can enable, and it adjusts the colors around you to indicate how much of a change in elevation there is relative to where you are. You can also fall back to the tablet if you want to see a little bit further out to find your way by enabling the terrain view in the options menu, and that'll give you a great view of everything around you in every direction. As you're traveling through valleys, instead of staying right down the middle, I tend to cheat a bit to the opposite side of my next turn just to see around the corner a little bit better and give myself more space to make the turn. There are times though where you can end up in a dead end if you aren't careful, and there are a few ways to get out of it depending on how high the peaks are and what kind of performance your plane has. It's always best to keep your airspeed up so that if you need to climb a couple hundred feet quickly, you can trade that airspeed for altitude, but there are still going to be situations where that just won't be enough to make it out. That's where the canyon turn comes into play, and I found a lot of differing opinions on the best way to do this, but all of them come down to a combination of either maintaining altitude or climbing, all the while doing a steep turn. You'll want to find a spot that'll give you the most space to turn around in the canyon, but once you're ready, you can use anywhere between 30 to 45 degrees of bank. Just remember though that the steeper the turn is, the higher your stall speed is going to become. For that reason, I've seen a lot of recommendations to apply full throttle as you start the turn, and if you have the excess energy, then you can climb at the same time as well, although I would probably do that closer to 30 degrees of bank instead. The slower your airspeed is, the tighter your turn radius is going to be, so you kind of have to ride that line of maintaining enough airspeed to avoid stalling, but not getting too fast that you increase your turn radius. Backcountry landings are probably the hardest part of bush flying. There are very few visual references or aids to help you, so it's hard to judge, and it often results in some of my worst landings. The first step is to overfly the field to build a mental image of what you're looking for when you get yourself turned around for a landing, because it's very easy to lose track of where the runway is, especially when you're in a foresty area. You should also try to spot the windsock as you're right overhead to get an idea of the winds and then decide which runway to land on, since just like for takeoff, you're unlikely to have an accurate wind report in the tablet. If there is no windsock, the backup solution, at least in the glass cockpit, is to bring up the wind speed and direction on the primary flight display, which can be enabled if you go digging around in the PFD options. In a lot of situations though, a normal rectangular circuit might not be feasible, especially if it's in a tight valley or between mountains, so you have to be ready to adapt how you'll get yourself onto final. The way I tend to do it is to fly just offset of the opposite runway that I'm planning to land on, which will give me a great view of the conditions on the ground. Then from there, I just keep going past the end of the runway until I feel like I'll have enough time to get turned around and lined up, descend, and get a good read on the landing zone. And this is always a bit further out than you think. The other factor to keep in mind is that you need enough space to effectively do a canyon turn like we discussed earlier, and in some cases that might mean going further out to then come back on your steps. It's very situational, but in a lot of ways it's even more important to have a stable approach in the backcountry because you don't have the references of a normal airport like landing lights, buildings, and so on. Ideally, as you're rolling out on final, you'll already be partially configured for the approach, and it's best to slow to your approach speed sooner rather than later, especially if you're a bit high. It's always best to do a normal approach down to the runway, and with smaller planes it's relatively easy to cut the power and increase your descent rate with full flaps, and if that isn't enough, you can also try to slip the plane down as well. The way you initiate a slip is to bank the wings in the direction that you want to slip, which is usually into the wind, and then you use opposite rudder to keep flying straight ahead. The more input you provide to the controls, the faster the descent rate will be, but it feels a bit unnatural to fly the plane this way, so I limit my usage of it unless it's really necessary. Slipping has the advantage of losing altitude faster because you expose more of the fuselage to the wind, so it increases drag and your descent rate without an associated increase in speed. Then once you've caught up to the proper descent rate, you can ease up on the controls and get back to a normal descent down to the runway, which is what you should be aiming to do. As you get close to the runway, you'll want to be just above your stall speed to reduce your landing distance, since a lot of these runways are very short and you have to hit your landing spot. Once you're on the ground, you also want to use as little brakes as possible because it is very easy to nose over, especially in a tail dragger, but it can happen with a tricycle gear as well. I hope you learned some useful tips for bush flying today, and make sure to like the video if you learned something useful and subscribe to get more similar content to this one.